Paris 1907. The city of light had no idea it was about to go dark. There was a studio on the Rue Ravignan, a crumbling building the artists who lived there had nicknamed Le Bateau, Lavoir of the laundry boat, because it swayed and creaked in the wind like something that should have sunk long ago. Inside one of its cramped, paint-stained rooms, a 5-year-old Spaniard had been working in almost total secrecy for 8 months. He barely left. He barely slept. He covered his windows during the day and painted by lamplight, as if afraid the sun itself might see what he was doing and report back to the rest of the art world before he was ready. His name was Pablo Picasso, and what he was building on that canvas was not a painting. It was a demolition. But this story does not begin in that studio. It begins in an argument. And like all the arguments that truly change history, it began quietly, between two men who respected each other just enough to be genuinely dangerous to one another. Henri Matisse was 37 years old in 1906, and he had already survived the kind of public humiliation that breaks most artists. 3 years earlier, he had shown his work at the Salon d'Automne alongside a group of painters whose vivid, almost violent use of color had caused a critic to call them les fauves, the wild beasts. The label was meant as an insult. Matisse had absorbed it and worn it like a crown. He had built his reputation on color as emotion, on the idea that a painting could reach directly into a person's nervous system through pure chromatic intensity. He believed that art should be, as he once wrote, like a good armchair, something that gave comfort, rest, and peace to the tired businessman. Picasso, when he heard this, reportedly smiled, but not warmly. The two men had been introduced through Gertrude Stein, the American writer and art collector whose apartment on the Rue de Fleuris had become something of a salon for the most restless creative minds in Paris. Stein collected paintings the way other people collected certainties, obsessively, instinctively, and with a willingness to be wrong that most collectors never develop. She had recognized something in both Matisse and Picasso before the rest of Paris did, and she had placed them, perhaps deliberately, in close enough orbit that collision was inevitable. At first, the relationship was almost tender. Matisse the elder had the authority of someone who had already fought his battles. Picasso the younger was still accumulating his ammunition. They exchanged paintings. They visited each other's studios. They talked about Cézanne, about African masks, about what painting could become if you were willing to follow the questions all the way to the edge and then keep walking. According to art historians who have studied their correspondence and the accounts of people close to both men, there was genuine intellectual excitement between them in those early years. Each saw in the other a mind serious enough to be worth defeating. But by 1906, something had shifted. Matisse had shown his painting called The Joy of Life at the Salon des Indépendants, and it had caused exactly the kind of scandal he had learned to expect and quietly enjoy. The canvas was large and deliberately strange. Figures in a landscape that was not quite any landscape. Color that did not pretend to be natural. Forms that bent away from anatomy towards something more like music. People were unsettled. Some were furious. Matisse was satisfied. What Matisse did not know was that Picasso had stood in front of that painting for a long time, longer than he let anyone see. And what he felt was not admiration. It was something closer to the sensation a chess player feels when the opponent makes a move that is brilliant but also, if you look carefully enough, reveals exactly where the real weakness is. Picasso went back to his studio and started a new canvas. 8 months later, in the late spring of 1907, he finally allowed a small number of people into Le Bateau, Lavoir, to see what he had been building. Among them was Henri Matisse. What Matisse saw when he walked into that room stopped him at the door. The painting was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall and nearly 8 feet wide. It showed 5 female figures, and it did something that no serious painting had done before in quite this way. It refused to choose a single viewpoint. The figures were seen from multiple angles simultaneously, as if the canvas itself had several eyes and none of them agreed on what they were looking at. The faces on the right side of the painting were influenced by African masks that Picasso had encountered at the Trocadéro Museum. Angular, flattened, stripped of the psychological softness that European portraiture had always relied on. The bodies were fractured into planes that collided and overlapped. There was no comfortable distance from which the image resolved into something familiar. The harder you looked, the more it broke apart. Matisse stared at it for a long time. Then he said something that, depending on which account you believe, ranged from sharply critical to genuinely contemptuous. Art historians have documented his reaction in various forms, but the substance is consistent. He did not think this was a great painting. He thought it was an act of aggression dressed up as innovation. He reportedly called it an attempt to ridicule the entire modern movement, a kind of nihilism that destroyed without offering anything in its place. Some accounts suggest he called it a deliberate insult to painting itself. He walked out of Le Bateau, Lavoir, and told several people in their shared social circle that Picasso would regret this painting, that it was the work of someone who had confused provocation with progress. Picasso said nothing publicly in response. He did not need to. The painting, which would eventually be called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, was not shown publicly for another 9 years. Picasso kept it rolled up in his studio. He did not exhibit it, did not sell it, did not explain it, but he also did not change a single brushstroke. He let it sit there in the dark, like something waiting for the world to catch up. What matters for this story is what happened in the years between Matisse's dismissal and the moment Paris finally began to understand what it had been shown. Because in those years, both men kept working, and what they were doing, whether they admitted it to each other or not, was responding. Every canvas was a move in a conversation that had no moderator and no agreed-upon rules. Matisse pushed his colors further into territory that felt almost hallucinatory, interiors where pattern consumed pattern, where the distinction between a wall and a tablecloth and a robe became almost philosophical. He was building a world where decoration was not a minor art but the entire argument, where the surface of things was exactly as deep as the soul of things. Picasso broke the surface entirely. He and a painter named Georges Braque developed what would come to be called cubism, a way of seeing that treated objects as if you could walk all the way around them and show everything you found on a single flat canvas. They reduced the palette almost to nothing: ochres, browns, grays. The color that Matisse had made his central instrument, Picasso essentially abandoned. Some critics read this as a direct response to Matisse's dominance in that area. Whether it was conscious strategy or intuitive necessity, the effect was the same. Picasso had found a weapon that Matisse could not easily pick up and use against him. By around 1910, Paris had organized itself into two camps, whether the artists themselves wanted this or not. There were those who believed that the future of painting ran through color and sensation, through the kind of work Matisse was doing. And there were those who believed it ran through structure and fragmentation, through cubism. The argument was everywhere, in cafes and galleries, in the pages of art criticism, in the conversations at Gertrude Stein's apartment where both men still occasionally appeared, carefully on different evenings. But here is the thing that tends to get lost when this rivalry is reduced to a simple contest both men knew, in the way that only serious artists know things, that the other was not wrong. That is what made the friction so productive and so unresolvable. Matisse understood, even if he would not easily say it, that Picasso had done something in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon that genuinely could not be undone. He had broken the pictorial convention that said a painting must choose a single moment, a single angle, a single emotional register. Once broken, that convention could not be restored. The history of painting had been permanently altered by a canvas that almost no one had seen, and Picasso, for his part, never stopped looking at what Matisse was doing. There is a well-documented pattern in his work throughout the 1910s and 20s. Whenever he was moving in one direction for an extended period, he would make a painting that seemed to deliberately reach toward Matisse's territory, warmer, more sensuous, more interested in the pleasure of color and pattern, and then pull back again, as if checking to make sure the door was still there, as if keeping a conversation going that neither man had formally agreed to have. What Matisse had called a deliberate insult to painting had become, within a decade, the most discussed and most influential work in modern art, not because people had decided to admire it on its own terms, but because the paintings that came after it, by Braque, by Joan Gris, by Fernand Léger, by dozens of others who followed the fracture lines Picasso had opened, had changed what painters thought was possible. The world had not just caught up to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, it had built an entire new architecture of seeing on top of it. Matisse, to his credit, was honest about this in ways that cost him something. In documented conversations from the 1920s, he spoke about Picasso with the precision of someone who has spent a long time studying an opponent and arrived at the uncomfortable conclusion that the opponent was also necessary. He did not retract his early criticism, but he placed it in a context that acknowledged what had happened since. He said, according to accounts preserved by people close to him, that Picasso was the only painter alive whose work genuinely disturbed him, and that disturbance in Matisse's vocabulary was not an insult. It was the closest thing to a compliment he could give. In 1913, when Les Demoiselles d'Avignon finally began circulating in reproductions and being discussed seriously in critical writing, a younger critic asked Matisse directly about his reaction to seeing it for the first time in that studio on Rue Ravignan. Matisse was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the critic remembered for the rest of his life. He said that when he walked out of Le Voir that day, he thought Picasso had made a terrible mistake. Then he said, I spent several years discovering that the mistake was mine. This is the part of the story that gets told less often than the conflict, because the conflict is easier to understand. Two great painters, two visions of what art should be, circling each other in the most creatively charged city in the world. The conflict is dramatic. The revision is quieter and, in some ways, more remarkable, because Matisse did not simply change his mind in the way a person changes their mind about a restaurant. He changed it in the way that a painter changes. Slowly, through the evidence of his own canvases, through the experience of continuing to work in a world that Picasso's painting had already altered, he kept painting. And in the act of painting over years, in rooms full of the specific light of the south of France, surrounded by the textiles and objects and models and windows that became his most persistent subject matter. He arrived somewhere that Picasso's fracture had made possible without Matisse ever having to follow Picasso's path. There is a photograph, not widely circulated but documented in several biographies of both men, taken sometime in the 1940s when both Matisse and Picasso were old enough to have become monuments in their own lifetimes. They are sitting together. Matisse is unwell. He would spend his final years largely bedridden, working in cut paper because he could no longer stand at a canvas. Picasso is still producing at a rate that bewildered people half his age. In the photograph, they are not looking at each other. They are looking at something outside the frame. But there is a quality to the way they are sitting, close, without the careful distance that people maintain when they are still in competition. That suggests something had been settled between them, not resolved, settled. Settled the way long arguments settle, not into agreement but into a shared understanding that the argument itself had been the point, that the paintings were the argument, that every canvas each of them had made since that day in Les Bateaux, Lavoir had been a sentence in a conversation that neither had wanted to stop, because stopping would have meant that one of them had nothing left to say. Matisse died in 1954. Picasso reportedly heard the news and was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he did not offer the kind of formal tribute that the moment seemed to call for. He said something that the person present would later describe as almost private in its feeling, as if Picasso were saying it to Matisse rather than about him. He said, "Now, there is no one left to talk to. This is what rivalry looks like when it is serious. Not destruction, not triumph. Two men who spent half a century making each other necessary, who built a version of modern art between them the way a river builds its canyon. Not by agreeing on a direction, but by pressing against each other with equal force, carving something enormous and irreplaceable out of the resistance itself." The painting that Matisse called a deliberate insult to painting now hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It is one of the most visited works in the building. People stand in front of it and feel something they often struggle to name. Not beauty in the conventional sense, not comfort, not the pleasure of recognition. Something more like the sensation of being looked at by something that sees you from several angles at once and refuses to pretend that any single view is the whole truth. Matisse's work hangs not far away, in galleries that feel warmer, more saturated, more obviously inviting, and people move between the two back and forth as if trying to hold both visions in their minds at the same time. They almost can, but not quite, which is exactly the point. If you have ever been told that your work is an insult, that your vision is a mistake, that the thing you made in the dark is a deliberate provocation, rather than a genuine attempt to find something true, then you already understand what Pablo Picasso understood when he rolled up that canvas and kept it in his studio for 9 years without changing a single line. Some paintings are not made for the moment they are finished. Some paintings are made for the moment the world finally has no choice but to see them clearly. And some arguments are not won. They are simply continued across decades in canvases and rooms full of Mediterranean light, until the men who started them are gone and the work they left behind goes on having the argument for them, forever in front of whoever is willing to stand still long enough to listen. Subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us when someone dismissed something you created. Did it stop you or push you further? Because sometimes the most important critic you will ever have is the one who tells you that you got it completely wrong, and turns out to be the person most responsible for proving you right.